It was the kind of wedding people whispered about long before it even began. The church smelled of lilies and rain, but underneath the perfume of celebration lingered the unease of disbelief. Margaret Hill, 60 years old and steady as stone, stood at the altar with trembling hands wrapped around a bouquet of fading roses. Across from her, Ethan Cole, 29, smiled that polite, distant smile of a man performing a role he'd rehearsed too many times. When the pastor asked if anyone objected, a hush fell that felt heavier than silence. Her daughter, Lily, sat in the second row, clutching her purse, eyes wet but not from joy. She couldn't meet her mother's gaze. And Margaret, pretending not to notice, focused on Ethan's smooth face, on the promise she believed was waiting inside his dark eyes. He had swept into her life like something out of an old love story. 6 months earlier, she had met him on a grief support forum. He'd said he'd lost his mother, that she reminded him of her kindness. He'd written her letters, real letters on paper, about poetry, second chances, and how love could bloom at any age. She had spent decades caring for others as a nurse. No one had ever cared for her the way Ethan seemed to. So when he knelt in her garden one rainy afternoon, ring trembling in his fingers, she said yes before her heart could warn her otherwise. Now, as the organ played and the guests clapped hesitantly, Margaret noticed something strange. Ethan never looked at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, on his phone, on anything but the woman he'd just promised forever to. She squeezed his hand during the vows, but his grip didn't tighten back. It only rested there, heavy, mechanical. After the ceremony, they moved to the reception hall, where white fairy lights blinked against the fogged windows. The crowd tried to be festive, though conversations circled back to the same quiet disbelief. She's old enough to be his mother. He's probably after her money. It won't last a month. Margaret laughed them off, or tried to. She danced once with him, slowly, to an old Sinatra song she'd chosen. But halfway through, his phone buzzed. He stopped mid-step, checked the screen, and muttered something about a friend from work. She watched him walk away, the song still playing to an empty space where her new husband should have been. From across the room, she caught Lily's expression, pity mixed with anger. It was the same look she'd worn when she begged her mother not to rush into marriage. "Mom, he's not what he says he is," Lily had whispered weeks earlier. Margaret had responded the way lonely people do when hope is all they have left. "You just don't want me to be happy." Now, seeing Ethan laugh quietly into his phone, she felt that same hope wobble. For a moment, the sounds of the party blurred. The clinking glasses, the forced laughter, the photographer calling for a kiss. When Ethan returned, his mood had shifted. His charm flickered back on like a switch. "You're beautiful, Maggie," he said, kissing her cheek. The photographer snapped the shot, capturing the moment forever, her glowing smile beside his hollow eyes. As the night thinned and the guests departed, the newlyweds drove away in silence. Rain tapped gently against the windshield. Margaret turned toward him, searching for warmth. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Of course," he said. But his voice carried no weight, just air. When they reached their new house, a lonely rental near the Oregon cliffs, he unlocked the door, stepped inside, and without looking back said, "We'll unpack tomorrow. I'm tired." Margaret lingered in the doorway, her wedding dress brushing the cold floor. She looked out toward the dark sea, the wind whipping the last petals from her bouquet. Somewhere deep inside her, a quiet voice whispered, "Something isn't right." She shut the door anyway. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of Oregon morning that carried the scent of salt and mist. Margaret awoke to an empty side of the bed, the sheets still cold. For a moment she thought Ethan was making coffee or unpacking the boxes stacked by the door. But the silence that filled the small house didn't sound like morning. It sounded like absence. She slipped on her robe and called his name. No answer. The front door stood ajar, the damp air creeping in. Outside, the driveway was empty. His car was gone. On the kitchen counter sat a note, written in his clean, slanted handwriting. "Had to handle something from my past. Don't wait up. Love you." Margaret stared at the words until they blurred. Something from his past. She told herself it might be about work, though she wasn't sure what he really did. He'd said he freelanced, odd jobs online. She had never asked much, afraid, maybe, of what she'd hear. The hours crawled. Rain whispered against the windows as she unpacked dishes that didn't belong to her, arranged photographs of a future she was still trying to believe in. When dusk arrived, she lit 2 candles on the dinner table and waited. Ethan returned past midnight. Headlights flashed through the curtains, then the soft creak of the door. He smelled of cigarettes and gasoline, his shirt half-buttoned, eyes darker than the night outside. "You didn't have to wait," he said flatly. "I was worried," she replied. "Where were you?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just clearing up a few things. You trust me, right?" She nodded before her mind could decide. When he turned away, she noticed a smear of something dark near his cuff. She reached for it instinctively. "Is that wine?" he interrupted quickly, pulling his arm back. "I met an old friend. We toasted." Then, as if the subject bored him, he walked past her and disappeared into the bathroom. The door closed with a soft click. Margaret sat down, her heart drumming unevenly. From the bathroom, water began to run, too long, too hot. The faint scent of bleach soon followed. Later, while folding his discarded shirt to wash it, she noticed the stain had spread wider than she'd thought, deep and brownish red. She hesitated, then dropped it into the laundry basket, telling herself again it was wine. It had to be. That night, they lay in the dark, inches apart. She whispered, "When are we leaving for our honeymoon?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, in a voice that sounded rehearsed, he said, "Soon. Maybe next week." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe everything. But the next morning, when she reached for her phone to show him possible destinations, Hawaii, maybe Spain, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Every wedding photo she'd taken had vanished. The entire album on her phone was gone. Even the backup folder was empty. "Ethan," she called from the kitchen, trying to keep her tone even. "Did you delete the pictures?" He appeared in the doorway, towels slung around his shoulders. "They looked unnatural," he said calmly. "You didn't look happy in them. We can take better ones later." "But those were memories," she whispered. He walked closer, lowering his voice. "Then make new ones. With me." His smile lingered a beat too long, and she felt something cold coil inside her chest. That afternoon, he told her he needed to visit the property's storage shed out back, and that she shouldn't come looking for him. "Some things are private," he added, locking eyes with her. As the sun faded, Margaret watched him disappear toward the trees, a shovel resting over his shoulder. The next time she heard him, it was long after dark. There was humming, low, tuneless, and the faint clink of metal from behind the house. She stood at the window, her hand pressed to the glass, whispering to herself, "He said we'd leave next week." But something in her heart already knew. They were never going on a honeymoon. The next morning, the fog hung low over the cliffs, swallowing the house in white silence. Margaret woke to the sound of the back door slamming shut. Through the lace curtains, she saw Ethan crossing the yard toward the old shed, the same one he'd told her never to enter. He carried a small box in one hand and a key in the other. For a long time, she just watched. The shed sat at the edge of the property, half hidden by tall grass and wild ivy. Its roof sagged like an old secret, and the door was fitted with a heavy padlock that didn't match the rest of the rusted hinges. When Ethan disappeared inside, a faint creak followed, then nothing. He returned 10 minutes later, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be up so early," he said, brushing past her in the kitchen. "I heard the door," she replied. "What's in the shed?" "Tools," he said too quickly. "Just tools. Don't go near it, okay? It's not safe." She nodded, but the curiosity gnawed at her all morning. By noon, Ethan had left again, saying he needed to run errands in town. His voice was calm, his smile automatic, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, as if memorizing her. When his car finally disappeared down the winding road, Margaret's pulse raced. She grabbed her cardigan and stepped into the cold air. The path to the shed was damp and soft beneath her slippers. Birds chirped somewhere distant, but even their sounds felt muffled, cautious. The door loomed before her, solid wood cold to the touch. She traced the edges of the padlock, noticing faint scratches near it, as if someone had tried to pry it open before. Beside the door, something metallic gleamed beneath the dirt. She bent down and found a small, tarnished locket. When she opened it, a faded photo of a smiling woman stared back. Margaret's breath caught. The woman looked older, maybe her age. But she had never seen her before. She tucked the locket into her pocket, heart pounding, and turned toward the house. That's when she heard it. A faint sound from inside the shed. Like music, soft, old-fashioned, coming from a radio. And then, unmistakably, a woman's voice humming along. Margaret froze. Her rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe a timer radio, or an echo from the neighbor's property. But there were no neighbors close enough for that. The voice came from inside. "Hello," she called softly. No response. The music stopped. She stepped back, every instinct screaming to run. Instead, she whispered, "Margaret, stop imagining things," and hurried back to the house. That evening, Ethan returned early. He smelled faintly of oil and smoke. "You've been outside," he said, glancing at her muddy slippers. "I was hanging laundry," she lied. He smiled faintly. "Good. The air's healthy for you." But as he passed, his hand brushed against her pocket. His fingers paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough to feel the shape of the locket inside. He didn't say a word, only looked at her with those still, dark eyes and continued walking toward the shed. Dinner was silent. He ate quickly, barely chewing. When she finally gathered courage to speak, she asked, "Why do you lock it?" He looked up slowly. "Because some doors stay closed." The words dropped between them like stones. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The image of the locket haunted her, the faint music replaying in her mind. Around midnight, she heard Ethan step outside again. Through the window, she saw him unlock the shed and disappear inside, carrying what looked like a lantern. Minutes later, a low hum filled the night air, the same tune she'd heard before, rising and falling like a lullaby for the dead. Margaret sat frozen in bed, tears gathering in her eyes. She didn't know who the woman in the locket was. But deep down, she feared she already understood. And as the shed door creaked shut once more, she knew she had to find someone, anyone, who might know what had happened before she came here. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, turning the locket over in her trembling hands. The face of the woman inside seemed to stare back at her with quiet warning. She had barely slept, haunted by the memory of that humming from the shed. She needed to talk to someone. Anyone. Around noon, a knock echoed through the hallway. When Margaret opened the door, she found a woman standing on the porch, a little older than Ethan, perhaps mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a cautious smile. "Hi there," the woman said. "I'm Joan Rivers. I live just down the hill. Thought I'd come welcome you to the neighborhood." Margaret hesitated. "Oh, that's kind of you. Please, come in." Joan stepped inside, glancing briefly around the house before her gaze landed on a wedding photo pinned to the fridge, the only one left that hadn't been deleted. "So you're the new bride," she said softly. "Ethan didn't mention you." Margaret frowned. "You know Ethan?" Joan's smile faltered. "Let's just say, we've met." They sat together over tea. At first, their talk was ordinary: gardens, the weather, how isolated the place felt. But beneath Joan's calm tone was something else. Caution, maybe even fear. "You bought this house recently?" Joan asked. "Ethan said he rented it from a friend," Margaret replied. Joan's eyes sharpened. "A friend?" She gave a low, humorless laugh. "That's one way to put it. There was another woman here before you. A few months ago." Margaret froze. "Before me?" Joan nodded. "An older lady. Sweet, quiet. She used to wave to me every morning when she fed the birds. Then one day she just stopped. I asked Ethan about her. He said she'd gone to stay with family." Margaret's stomach twisted. "Did you know her name?" "I think it was Helen," Joan whispered. "She looked a lot like you, actually." The words sank like ice. The locket. The humming. The scratches on the shed door. Margaret tried to keep her voice steady. Do you think something happened to her?" Joan hesitated, then leaned closer. I don't know. But I do know Ethan's been here before. With different women. And none of them ever stayed long. Margaret's teacup rattled in her hand. Why didn't you tell anyone? I did, Joan said quietly. But there was never proof. And he can be very convincing when he wants to be. She reached across the table, lowering her voice. If I were you, I'd leave. Tonight. Margaret looked toward the window. The shed stood silent and still beneath the gray sky. I can't just leave, she said. He'll find me. Joan opened her mouth to reply, but the sound of tires crunching gravel made them both flinch. Ethan's truck had pulled into the driveway. Hide the tea set, Margaret whispered, heart racing. He doesn't like visitors. Joan's eyes widened. I should go. She stood quickly, but before she reached the door, Ethan's shadow filled the porch window. Who's here? His voice called, calm but sharp. Margaret forced a smile as he entered. Just the neighbor. She brought tea. Ethan nodded politely at Joan, though his gaze lingered too long. That's kind of you, he said. But my wife needs rest. It's been a long week. Joan's lips pressed into a thin line. Of course. She turned to Margaret. Take care of yourself, dear. Her tone carried a warning hidden beneath the pleasantry. When the door shut behind her, Ethan turned. What did she want? Just to say hello, Margaret murmured. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. Don't talk to her again. She spread stories. That night, Margaret lay awake replaying Joan's words. Tonight. But her fear kept her anchored to the bed, listening to the faint creak of the shed door outside and the humming that began once more, low and haunting in the wind. By morning, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and moaning through the chimney. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, watching the clouds roll in from the sea. Ethan had already left. He always did after breakfast, offering vague explanations about errands, calls, or unfinished business. He never said where he went, and she had stopped asking. But after what Joan told her, silence no longer felt like safety. It felt like surrender. She needed proof. Something real, something she could hold in her hands to make sense of the dread curling through her chest. She started with the study, a small room Ethan used as his office. Papers were scattered across the desk, receipts, envelopes, old rental contracts, but what caught her attention was a leather suitcase pushed halfway beneath the couch. It was dusty, heavy, and locked with a thin brass latch. She hesitated, listening to the ticking of the clock, then pried it open with a kitchen knife. Inside lay an old photo album. Black leather, cracked at the edges, smelling faintly of mildew and cologne. Her stomach tightened as she lifted the cover. The first page held a picture of Ethan standing beside a woman in front of a lake. She looked to be in her 50s, gray curls, soft smile. A handwritten caption beneath it read, Martha, Summer 2016. Margaret flipped to the next page. Another woman. Another smile. Linda, 2018. Then another, Helen, 2019. The same woman Joan had mentioned. Each photo followed the same pattern. Ethan beside a different woman, always older, always affectionate. Some of the women wore wedding rings. Some held his hand. But what chilled Margaret most was the way Ethan looked in every photo. Identical expression, identical half-smile. No joy. No warmth. Just repetition. Her breath hitched when she reached the last page. There, tucked under the plastic sleeve, was a clipping from a newspaper. Local widow found dead in her bathtub, police suspect foul play. The date was from a year ago. The name of the victim, Helen Carter. Margaret's fingers went cold. Her vision blurred. Helen, the woman in the photo, the woman in the locket she'd found outside the shed. She closed the album, her heart hammering against her ribs. The front door creaked. Margaret! Ethan's voice floated down the hall. She shoved the album back into the suitcase, snapping the latch shut just as he stepped into the room. What are you doing? He asked, eyes darting toward the couch. I was cleaning, she said quickly, forcing a smile. The dust in here is awful. He studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. You don't need to clean. That's my space. He walked over, brushing a hand along the edge of the desk. You trust me, right? Yes. she whispered, though her voice trembled. Good, he said softly, leaning closer. Because I don't like secrets. The words lingered in the air like a threat. That night, Margaret couldn't eat. She sat at the table, pushing her food around her plate as Ethan talked about maybe selling the house soon, moving somewhere warmer. You'd like Arizona, he said. Quiet, peaceful. Would we stay near the water? She asked absently. He smiled. No water there. Just sand. The way he said it made her stomach twist. When he finally went to bed, she waited, listening for the slow rhythm of his breathing, then slipped into the study once more. She opened the suitcase again, her hands shaking. Beneath the album, she found something new, a folded document. It was a marriage certificate, hers and Ethan's. But behind it were 4 others, each with different women's names, the same officiant's signature, and the same groom. The dates spanned almost a decade. A sound escaped her, half sob, half gasp. She covered her mouth, tears blurring her vision. Her phone lay in her pocket. She thought of calling Lily, of running to the neighbor's house, of anything that meant escape. But before she could decide, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Ethan's voice came softly through the dark. You're up late. She froze, clutching the album to her chest. I couldn't sleep, she managed. He stepped into the doorway, his face half-shadowed. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he smiled, the same hollow smile from the photographs. You're not like them, he whispered. You'll last longer. The air left her lungs. Ethan turned, leaving her in the dark. His footsteps faded, followed by the familiar creak of the back door, the path toward the shed. Margaret sank to her knees, clutching the photo album against her heart, the faint scent of damp earth seeping in from outside. She didn't need to look to know where he was going, or what he might be bearing. And as thunder rolled across the cliffs, she realized the truth. If she didn't find a way out soon, her picture would be the next one in that album. The storm hadn't stopped all night. Rain lashed against the windows in heavy, uneven bursts, and thunder rolled somewhere deep beyond the cliffs. Margaret sat curled on the couch, the photo album still hidden beneath her blanket, her heart too restless for sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind felt like breath on her neck. Ethan had gone to bed hours ago, but she couldn't bear to lie beside him. Not after what she'd seen. Not after his words, "You'll last longer." Around midnight, she picked up her phone. Her hands trembled as she scrolled to Lily's name. For the first time in weeks, she pressed call. The line rang twice before her daughter's tired voice answered. Mom? It's late. Are you okay? Margaret hesitated, staring into the dark hallway. No, she whispered. Lily, I think I made a mistake. What do you mean? I don't know how to explain. He's not who I thought he was. I found pictures, other women, then a floorboard creaked above her. Margaret froze. Wait. Mom. She muted the phone, her pulse thundering in her ears. She listened. The sound came again, slow steps on the stairs. Ethan was awake. Margaret whispered into the phone. He's coming. If I hang up, don't call back. Just, please, come tomorrow. Bring someone. Mom, what's happening? You're scaring me. But before she could answer, a shadow filled the doorway. Ethan stood there in the faint glow of lightning, his face calm, unreadable. Who are you talking to? Margaret's throat closed. Psst, Lily. She couldn't sleep. He smiled faintly. Neither could I. He reached for the phone. Let me say hi. She ended the call before he could touch it. She's already asleep, she said, forcing a weak laugh. Ethan studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, You don't need to call her so late. It makes you anxious. I know, she murmured. Come to bed. When she didn't move, his tone sharpened. Now. Margaret rose slowly, feeling his eyes on her as she crossed the hall. In the bedroom, he lay down and patted the empty space beside him. You're safe here, he said softly, though the words sounded more like a command than comfort. She lay stiffly beside him, eyes fixed on the ceiling. His breathing slowed. She waited, counting each exhale until it evened out. Only then did she slip quietly from the bed. In the dark, she opened her phone again and pressed record on the voice memo app. Her whisper trembled. If something happens to me, Ethan Cole, my husband, is responsible. There are photos, documents, and a shed behind the house. Please, someone find them. She saved the recording and hid the phone under the loose floorboard near the nightstand. The wind howled again, shaking the windows. She could still hear faint humming outside, the same melody from the shed, distant yet unmistakable. Margaret sat by the window until the clock struck 3. Then, quietly, the phone buzzed once more. Lily calling back. Margaret's trembling hand hovered over the screen. She wanted to answer, to tell her daughter everything. But before she could decide, Ethan stirred. His hand reached across the bed, searching for her. The buzzing stopped. The room fell into silence again. Margaret exhaled shakily, clutching the edge of the curtain as lightning flashed over the sea. For a moment, she saw her reflection in the glass, pale, hollow-eyed, already halfway ghost. Behind her, Ethan murmured in his sleep, a single phrase that made her blood freeze. "Don't run." The storm outside roared louder, drowning the sound of her quiet sob. She turned back to the window, whispering to herself, "Tomorrow. I'll tell someone tomorrow." But deep down, she already knew, tomorrow might never come. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun broke through gray clouds, spilling light over the drenched garden. But inside the house, the air was heavier than ever, thick, tense, still. Margaret woke to find the other side of the bed cold. Ethan was gone. For a moment, she thought he might have gone for a drive or to town, but then she heard the faint sound of humming again. That same lullaby-like tune. The same one from the shed. Her heart clenched. He was out there. Margaret moved slowly, careful not to make the floorboards creak. She dressed quietly, slipped her phone into her pocket, and crept to the window. From the second floor, she could see him, Ethan, standing by the shed, sleeves rolled up, shovel in hand. He wasn't digging this time. He was covering something. A chill rippled through her. The earth near the shed was disturbed, dark and wet. A tarp half buried in the mud caught the morning light. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a hand beneath it, a pale, unmoving hand. Margaret stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. He looked up. Their eyes met through the window. Ethan's face broke into that soft, reassuring smile she'd once loved. He waved as if nothing was wrong and called out, "Breakfast in 10, sweetheart." She forced a nod, retreating from the window. Her legs felt numb. The image of that hand wouldn't leave her mind. In the kitchen, she sat at the table as Ethan slid a plate toward her. "You look pale," he said, his tone casual. "Bad dreams?" Margaret didn't answer. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her fork. "You were outside early," she murmured. "What were you doing?" "Just cleaning up after the storm," he said smoothly. "Branches, debris, you know how it gets." He sipped his coffee, watching her over the rim of his mug. "You don't trust me, do you?" Margaret set her fork down. "Ethan, what's in that shed?" He leaned back, smile fading. For a long, dreadful moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "You shouldn't have gone near it." Her blood ran cold. "So there is something." He sighed, rubbing his temples like a weary parent scolding a child. "You were doing so well, Margaret. Peaceful. Obedient. Why ruin that?" Her voice quavered. "Who's buried there?" He met her eyes, and smiled again. "You mean who else?" The room tilted around her. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to breathe. "What did you just say?" Ethan stood and began clearing the dishes, his movements calm, methodical. "You think you're the first person to love me enough to ignore the truth? To believe the lies?" He chuckled softly. "You're not. Not even close." Her voice cracked. "How many?" He turned, leaning on the counter, eyes dark with amusement. "For before you. For women who thought I could be fixed. That their love would change me. And now, Margaret felt the world collapse around her. "You killed them." He shrugged lightly. "They left me no choice. They got too curious. Too loud." "Why me?" she whispered. He stepped closer, his tone suddenly tender. "Because you were lonely. Because I could see it in your eyes. the desperation to be needed again. You made it easy. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You planned this. Of course, he said almost gently. Every part of it. She backed away. The photos in the album, the women. They're my trophies, he said without shame. Memories. I only keep one picture of each. Margaret's voice was barely a breath. I'm next. Ethan smiled softly, almost lovingly. You already are. Lightning didn't flash this time, only silence. The quiet was worse than thunder. Margaret felt every heartbeat scream inside her chest. I'll go pack my things, she whispered, trembling. If you let me leave, I won't tell anyone. Ethan tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle. You think it's that simple? She forced herself to nod. You don't need to hurt me. He sighed, almost regretfully. I liked you, Margaret. I really did. But you shouldn't have called your daughter last night. Her breath caught. How do you? I heard the phone, he said. You talked about me. Her stomach dropped. Ethan leaned closer, his whisper ice cold. By tomorrow, you'll be gone. Just like the others. And when they find you, if they ever do, you'll be remembered as the foolish old woman who married a stranger. He walked out, leaving her trembling in the kitchen. Margaret waited until his footsteps faded, then bolted upstairs. Her hands shook as she retrieved the phone from under the floorboard. She replayed the voice memo, listening to her own whisper. Then she opened her camera, zoomed in through the window, and took one photo, Ethan standing by the shed, shovel in hand, the earth freshly turned. Her proof. Her only chance. And as she hit send to Lily's number, the screen flickered. No service. The signal was gone. Outside, Ethan looked up again. This time, he wasn't smiling. The storm clouds had vanished, but dread lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The air in the house was unnaturally still, too quiet, as though the walls themselves were listening. Margaret hadn't slept. She'd spent the night sitting by the window, clutching her useless phone. The message to Lily never sent. The single photo, the only proof she had, was trapped on a device without a signal. She'd checked a dozen times, but the no service icon still mocked her. By morning, Ethan was nowhere to be seen. The shed door was open again. She could see the tarp flapping in the breeze, the disturbed soil darker than before. The smell lingered now, earth mixed with something metallic, something final. She knew she had to leave. Margaret stuffed her wallet, car keys, and the photo album into a small bag. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped them. Every sound in the house made her flinch, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the grandfather clock. She tiptoed toward the front door. The lock clicked softly. Just as she turned the handle, a familiar voice said behind her, "Going somewhere?" She froze. Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, his hair damp, shovel leaning casually against his shoulder. His eyes were calm, almost serene. "You're up early." Margaret swallowed hard. I thought I'd drive into town. We're out of milk." He descended the stairs slowly, the sound of his shoes on the wooden steps echoing like a heartbeat. "You don't drink milk." Her grip tightened on the bag. "I just need some air, Ethan. I'm not feeling well." He smiled faintly. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Please, just let me go. I won't say anything. I swear." He set the shovel down by the door. "You already did, Margaret. You called your daughter. You took a picture." Her heart dropped. How did you?" "I checked your phone while you slept," he said simply. "It's clever what you did. But too late." Her knees weakened. "Please, Ethan." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a chilling whisper. "You should have trusted me. You might have been the last one to live." Margaret stumbled back, tripping over the rug. The bag fell open, photos scattering across the floor. One of them slid to his feet, the image of him at the shed, shovel in hand. For the first time, his smile faltered. Margaret saw her moment. She grabbed the nearest thing, a glass vase, and hurled it. It shattered beside his head, and she bolted for the door. Ethan lunged, catching her wrist. "You can't leave." She screamed, twisting free. Her nails raked his arm. She shoved the door open and ran, barefoot into the wet grass, her breath ragged, heart hammering. Behind her, Ethan shouted her name. She didn't look back. The road was a blur of mud and gravel. She sprinted toward her car, fumbling with the keys. But before she could reach it, the sound of an engine roared behind her. Ethan's truck. Headlights flared. Tires spat mud. Margaret dove into the woods. Branches whipped her face, her nightgown tearing as she stumbled through the undergrowth. The forest swallowed her cries. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing near an old stone wall. For a moment, all she could hear was her pulse pounding in her ears. Then, silence. No engine. No footsteps. She waited, trembling, until the sky began to pale with dawn. Slowly, she pulled herself to her feet and looked back toward the house. From where she stood, she could see smoke curling up from the shed. Dark, heavy, and rising fast. Her stomach turned. He was burning it. Burning them. She covered her mouth to keep from screaming. Tears streaked down her face. She knew now that even if she escaped, the evidence would vanish with the fire. 2 days. That's how long it had been since she married Ethan Cole. 2 days since she said, "I do." 2 days too late to undo the mistake that would cost her everything. In the distance, the siren of a police car finally echoed faintly, too far away to matter. Margaret sank to her knees in the dirt, whispering, "Please, let them find me before he does." And behind her, just beyond the trees, a shadow moved. By the time the police sirens reached the edge of the property, Margaret was gone. The woods swallowed her whole, leaving behind only muddy footprints that vanished near the stream. Ethan told the officers she had a tendency to wander, his voice perfectly calm, his clothes freshly changed, no trace of the blood that had soaked into his sleeve hours earlier. 2 days married, he told them with a practiced sigh. She's confused, grieving. Maybe she ran off. The officers searched briefly before the rain started again. No one thought to check the shed, the one now reduced to a smoldering pile of ashes. But miles away, a different set of eyes was watching. The morning after Margaret disappeared, a local hiking vlogger named Chris Wilmer uploaded a new video to his channel. Exploring abandoned farms, found something weird. He'd flown his drone over the coastal region for B-roll footage, capturing long shots of cliffs, fields, and scattered rural homes. One frame caught his attention as he reviewed the footage that night. A house near the edge of the forest, smoke still rising from a shed. At first, he thought it was just a burn pile. But then he noticed movement, something small, pale, darting between the trees. A person. Running. He rewound, zoomed in. A woman. Older, barefoot, wearing a white nightgown torn at the hem. Her face streaked with mud and terror. She stumbled, glanced back once, toward a man emerging from the smoke. Chris froze. "What the hell?" he whispered. He paused the video again, zooming closer. The man's face flickered in the frame, a single clear shot before the drone tilted. Sharp eyes, dark hair, a faint smile. The camera caught it all. Chris uploaded the video as usual, not realizing what he'd captured. But hours later, the comments flooded in. "Wait, does anyone else see that guy chasing her? Is this real? Looks like she's running for her life." Timestamp 3:14. Pause there. The clip went viral overnight. At 7 a.m., Detective Laura Chen from the county sheriff's office received a call from her niece. "Aunt Laura, you have to see this YouTube video. It's trending. I think it's from your district." By 8 a.m., Laura and her team were watching the drone footage frame by frame. She leaned closer to the monitor, her eyes narrowing at the man in the background. "Freeze it there. Zoom in." The technician obeyed. Ethan Cole's face filled the screen. Laura exhaled slowly. "Pull the marriage record for Cole. Cross-check with any recent missing persons." Within minutes, Margaret's name appeared. 2 days married. No return calls. No banking activity. "Get a warrant," Laura said. "We're going to his house." Back at the coastal property, Ethan stood on the porch, sipping coffee, when he saw the first patrol car roll up the dirt road. He didn't flinch. Didn't even look surprised. "Mr. Cole," Laura said, stepping out, badge glinting in the sun. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your wife. He smiled easily. Of course. I've been worried sick. She studied his calm demeanor. Mind if we look around? Not at all, he said smoothly, stepping aside. Though I'm afraid the shed caught fire last night. Total loss. Laura's gaze swept the scorched ground. The smell of burnt wood still lingered, faint but distinct. Something metallic shimmered among the ashes, half-melted jewelry, twisted beyond recognition. Her gut tightened. Mr. Cole, she said evenly, when's the last time you saw your wife? He paused, eyes glinting. 2 days ago. The words hung in the air, cold, precise, rehearsed. Laura glanced toward the tree line, where the drone footage had shown movement. The forest stood silent now, concealing its secrets. But somewhere beyond those trees, she knew, the truth was waiting to be found. And though she didn't know it yet, the footage wasn't the only recording Margaret had left behind. Detective Laura Chen stood in Margaret Cole's bedroom, the morning light spilling weakly across the floorboards. The house smelled faintly of smoke and sea salt, the air heavy with secrets. Ethan Cole had been taken into temporary custody, but only for questioning. There was still no physical proof linking him to anything beyond a missing person report and a suspicious fire. Laura's instincts, however, screamed otherwise. She crouched beside the bed, studying the uneven planks. Something about them seemed off, one board slightly raised, as though it had been pried open before. She tapped it with the edge of her flashlight. "Hello. Get me a pry bar," she said. A deputy handed her one. With a soft creak, the board lifted free. Beneath it, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was a phone, Margaret's phone. Laura's pulse quickened. "Bag it," she said, but not before noticing the voice memo icon blinking on the locked screen. She hesitated, then tapped it. A faint hiss filled the room. Then a whisper. "If something happens to me, Ethan Cole, my husband, is responsible." The voice trembled, fragile but resolute. "There are photos, documents, and a shed behind the house. Please, someone find them." The recording ended with the sound of rain tapping against the window, then silence. Laura exhaled, staring at the phone like it was alive. "Get this to forensics immediately," she ordered, "and run a recovery on deleted files." By afternoon, the forensic technician found 3 deleted voice memos, all recorded within hours of each other. The last one was time-stamped at 2:57 a.m., just minutes before Margaret's final phone call to her daughter. Laura sat in the darkened office, headphones on, the storm from the night before echoing faintly through the speakers. "He's outside again," Margaret whispered on the tape. "I see him by the shed. He's humming. I think he's burying someone. God help me, I saw a hand." The detective's pen froze mid-note. The next part was quieter, the tone shifting from fear to determination. "If anyone finds this, please, tell Lily I'm sorry. Tell her I tried to leave." Then, faintly, another voice entered the recording. "Come too close. You shouldn't be up, Margaret." The sound of a struggle followed, the phone scraping across the floor, a muffled scream, and then a single, haunting line before the audio cut out completely. "You'll be number 5. Laura removed the headphones slowly, her throat dry. "We have him," she whispered. The next morning, she returned to the Cole property with a search team. The moment they reached the backyard, the scent of ash and decay grew stronger. The ground near the shed was still damp and uneven. Laura's boots sank slightly into the soft earth. "Start digging," she said. Within minutes, a deputy called out. "Detective, you need to see this." Beneath the burned remains of the shed, wrapped in melted tarp and rotting cloth, were fragments of bone, several sets. One was smaller, a woman's wrist still bearing the outline of a gold bracelet. Laura closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. "Mark it. Call forensics. And get the coroner out here." From the house, Ethan's voice drifted faintly. He was sitting on the porch, cuffed, smirking as the officers moved about the property. "You'll never prove which ones are mine," he called out. "They're all just memories." Laura turned, her expression cold. "We don't have to. Your wife already did." He tilted his head, amusement flickering across his face. "You mean that tape?" Anyone could have recorded that. Grieving woman, paranoid, confused. It won't hold in court. Laura stepped closer. Maybe not on its own. But there's something else. He frowned slightly. What's something else? She didn't answer, just looked toward the forensics van pulling up the driveway. The technician stepped out, holding a small flash drive in a sealed bag. Detective Chen, the tech said, recovered deleted files from the phone. One's labeled, final recording. It's video. Ethan's smirk faded. Laura's voice was steady. Let's finish this at the station. As he was led away, his calm mask began to crack. You don't know what you're dealing with, he hissed. You think she was innocent? She was part of it too. Laura ignored him, her focus locked on the evidence bag. Later that night, in the quiet hum of the forensic lab, the video played on a monitor. The camera faced a trembling Margaret, her eyes red, her face streaked with tears. Behind her, faintly lit by lightning, the shed door hung open. He killed them, she whispered. For women before me. I found their things. Their names. He said I'd be next. If you're watching this, please, stop him. Her breath hitched. A noise, footsteps, interrupted her. She looked toward the door, eyes wide. Please. The screen went black. Laura leaned back in her chair, her heart heavy. We will, Margaret, she murmured. We'll stop him. But as the lab lights flickered and the storm outside grew louder, no one noticed that the video file had a timestamp. 2:59 a.m. Rain fell again that night, a relentless curtain over the coastal cliffs, washing away the traces of the day's excavation. The coal property was now surrounded by yellow tape, floodlights glaring through the mist like unblinking eyes. Detectives moved in and out of the house, the low hum of radios cutting through the storm. But in the middle of it all, one figure stood perfectly still, Ethan Cole, his expression unreadable, the faintest smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth. Detective Narration watched him from the porch. She'd spent all day listening to Margaret's final recordings, every word burrowing into her mind like a splinter. The victims' names, the buried remains, the evidence, it was all there. But one question still gnawed at her. Why 4 confirmed victims, all identified through bone fragments and personal belongings. The 5th, Margaret, was missing. There was no body, no trace. Only her last terrified words on that video. If you're watching this, please, stop him. Laura wasn't satisfied with loose ends. She turned toward Officer Ramos, who was packing up evidence bags near the shed. We're missing one grave, she said quietly. Ramos frowned. We've dug up everything around the shed, ma'am. Nothing else left to find. Laura shook her head. Not here. Her eyes drifted toward the dark slope beyond the property, the cliff path that led down to the sea. The same direction the drone footage had shown Margaret running. Minutes later, with flashlights in hand, the team followed her down the narrow trail. Mud slid under their boots, the air thick with salt and decay. Waves crashed violently against the rocks below, roaring like some great, hungry thing. Halfway down the path, Laura stopped. Her light swept across something half buried in the mud, a glint of metal. She crouched, brushing the soil away. It was a small gold locket, cracked and caked in dirt. Inside, barely visible beneath the grime, was a faded photo, Margaret's daughter, Lily. Laura's chest tightened. She was here. The team began digging carefully, the rain soaking through their jackets. And then, the dull thud of shovel against wood. Detective, one officer called out, voice trembling. We found a box. It was small, rotted through, and wrapped in tarp. Laura knelt beside it, lifting the corner gently. Inside lay something that stopped everyone cold, a half-burned notebook, its edges blackened, the words inside smeared but still legible in places. He keeps a list, one line read. For before me. I saw their names in his drawer. But there's one more, the first. The one he never told anyone about. Laura's pulse quickened. The first victim, she murmured. That's the missing piece. Back at the station, she opened the evidence box found in Ethan's locked office. Letters, IDs, and photos of women, each labeled by year. 2007, 2010, 2014, 2020. And then one unmarked envelope, older than the rest, yellowed with age. Inside was a newspaper clipping, local teen missing, last seen with family friend. The photo was of a 16-year-old girl smiling beside a young man. The caption read, Ethan Cole, 23, family acquaintance. Laura stared at the name for a long moment. He started with her, she said softly. His first kill. Ethan sat in the interrogation room, hands cuffed, humming that same haunting tune. Laura entered quietly and placed the photo in front of him. She was the first, wasn't she? Before the others. Before you learned to hide them. He looked up, his eyes calm but sharp. Everyone forgets their first, he said. But not me. I remember all of them. Why Margaret? Laura pressed. Why after all these years? Ethan leaned back, smiling faintly. Because she reminded me of my mother. The way she looked at me, pity, fear, love all mixed together. I couldn't let it end any other way. Laura's stomach turned. She wasn't like the others. He nodded. No. She was smarter. She almost made it. His smile widened. Almost. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face for a brief, chilling second. Laura stood, voice steady but cold. We found your last grave, Ethan. The one you didn't finish digging. His smirk faltered. She left something else for us, Laura continued. That locket and the notebook. She wrote about you, about the first girl. She made sure your story would end. For the first time, his eyes flickered with something like fear. Laura leaned closer. You'll never see daylight again. As she left the room, the rain began to ease. The storm had finally broken. Back at the cliffside, search crews sealed off the final dig site. Beneath the churned mud and rock, another small skeleton was uncovered, the remains of the missing girl from 2007. 5 victims. 5 graves. And one woman brave enough to make sure the truth was never buried. The morning after Ethan Cole's arrest dawned eerily quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fragile calm that felt almost unnatural. Seagulls circled above the cliffs, their cries echoing across the water like ghosts refusing to rest. Detective Laura Chen stood by the shoreline, watching the sunrise burn away the mist, but peace was still far from her mind. In the interrogation room, Ethan's final words looped in her thoughts. She almost made it. Almost. The word clung to her like a curse. Because something about Margaret's disappearance still didn't fit. The evidence confirmed 5 victims, but none of the remains matched her DNA. No trace of her body had been found. And yet, every clue she'd left behind, the notebook, the locket, the drone footage, had guided the investigation like breadcrumbs. As if Margaret wanted to be found, or wanted something else entirely. At noon, Laura returned to the Cole residence. The property was silent now, emptied of officers and media vans. Inside, the scent of damp wood and bleach hung in the air. She walked slowly down the hallway to the basement, the one place that had never fully given up its secrets. There, under a half-torn rug, Laura noticed something new, a faint outline of a square hatch she hadn't seen before. Her heart quickened. She knelt, pried it open, and a cold draft swept upward. The beam of her flashlight revealed a narrow tunnel leading down beneath the foundation. Ramos, she called into her radio. Bring backup and lights. I think we've got something. The tunnel stretched deep, winding beneath the cliff. The walls were reinforced with old planks and cement, the air damp and stale. Then, as Laura stepped into a small chamber at the end, her light fell upon something that made her breath catch. A makeshift room, lined with shelves, food cans, water jugs, and a bed. A bed that looked recently used. On the wall above it, scratched into the concrete, were the words, "I'm not one of them." Laura's flashlight trembled in her hand. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." A rustle came from behind. She spun, gun raised, only to see a figure step into the light, slow, hesitant. Her hair was unevenly cut, her clothes ragged, but her eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. "Margaret." The woman nodded weakly. "He thought I was dead," she whispered. "But I ran. I hid down here." For a moment, Laura couldn't speak. The woman everyone believed dead, the fifth victim, had survived. Margaret sank against the wall, trembling. He came looking. I heard him digging above me one night. I thought, if I moved, if I breathed too loud, he'd find me. So I stayed. I waited for someone to see what he did. You left the clues, Laura said softly. The drone, the notebook. Margaret's lips quivered into a faint smile. I had to make him think I was gone. That was the only way to make him slip up. Laura exhaled, the weight of every unanswered question suddenly lifting. Margaret hadn't just survived, she had orchestrated his downfall. By evening, the cliffside was swarming again, medics, press, and investigators flooding the property as news of her survival broke. Ethan Cole, upon hearing, erupted in a violent rage in his cell, screaming that it was impossible, that he'd finished the job. But it didn't matter now. His words meant nothing. Later that night, Laura visited Margaret at the hospital. The woman sat by the window, bandaged, pale, but alive, her reflection cast against the darkening sky. Why didn't you run farther? Laura asked quietly. Margaret's voice was soft but steady. Because running doesn't stop men like him. Exposing them does. She turned, her gaze firm. He thought he buried me. But I buried him instead, in his own lies. Laura nodded slowly. You outsmarted him. Margaret looked back out the window, where the sea glimmered under the moonlight. No, she said. I just stopped being afraid. Silence filled the room, not the uneasy kind that had haunted the investigation, but a clean, peaceful one. The kind that followed justice. As Laura left, she glanced once more at the patient file on the counter. Margaret's name had been changed. New identity, new life. Witness protection. Outside, the ocean was calm again, the cliffs no longer cloaked in fog. A week later, Ethan Cole's trial began, but without Margaret's testimony, it wouldn't have mattered. The evidence she'd left behind was enough to lock him away forever. The photo album, the confession tape, the buried victims, every piece of the puzzle she had orchestrated from the shadows. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Laura didn't stay to watch Ethan's reaction. She'd already seen his real punishment, being beaten at his own game by the woman he believed powerless. That night, far from the town that once whispered her name, Margaret watched the sunset from his safe house window, her hands trembling around a mug of tea. For the first time in years, she breathed freely. Behind her, on the table, sat a single photograph. The drone still shot of Ethan standing over the fifth grave. The one that caught everything. She smiled faintly. You thought you buried me, she murmured. But I was the one digging your grave. And as the light faded, so did the last shadow of the man who once thought no one would ever see what he'd done. The end.